Have you ever been told, hey, it's a knit, it'll fit, it stretches, don't worry about it, and then been super disappointed? It's not just me, right? Because that sucks. Especially for people with large breasts, it's a problem. So let's talk about doing a full bust adjustment on a knit top that doesn't have any darts, just like your favorite t-shirt. So you make a t-shirt and you're super excited because the design's super cute, the fabric you picked for it is super beautiful, and you try it on, but there are problems. Namely, you can see this gigantic line coming from the middle of your arm straight to the top of your chest, indicating that it is pulling like crazy and it's just not fitting right. That's probably a full bust adjustment that needs to be done on that pattern. In the example you see on camera right now, you can see that there are some weird problems going on. So for example, you have the lines that I already talked about coming from the arms. You have tightening around the chest. The fabric is pulling very weird over the chest as well. The fabric is stretched to its limit. It doesn't look like it's very flattering because it's nothing but wrinkles and pulling from the arms all across the bust. Full bust adjustments themselves are really not that difficult. In general, what they'll be doing is creating width across the chest, so adding a little bit length over the bust point itself. So it expands the area and just allows a little bit more space there, so the fabric is not being pulled to its limit on that knit. We'll be going over quite a few concepts in this video, so please feel free to check out and jump ahead to any section that might be more relevant to your sewing level at this time. But obviously I recommend starting from the top and watching the whole thing just because all the skills will build on each other. But let's get started. Before picking your pattern size, before deciding how much of a full bust adjustment you need to do on your pattern, it is important to prioritize the fabric. Why? Seems counterintuitive. Totally understand, but hear me out. It's really important to understand the fabric that you're working with. So for example, if there's very visible ribbing, if you stretch it just 25% or 50% or 100%, those ribs are going to look very different across the body. Depending on the thickness of the fabric you use, if you're using like a terry, slightly more thin knit, it can absolutely change the way that the fabric lays down or the way that it's pressed. So these are things that you're going to want to test first. What's happened to me a few times is that I will find a beautiful fabric and I'm like, oh, that'll look great, and let's start with that. But I stretch it out and the bounce back of the fabric is like a glacier. It does not bounce back and it just stays stretched out and warped until I rewash it again. No good. You don't want that, especially if you have a bigger chest and you're looking to make yourself a really nice top. So let's say you've already found some beautiful fabrics that you might want to use for your particular garment. And so at this point, it's time to pull out the ruler and the calculator because we're gonna do some math. If I can do it, an art school student who did not do very well in any of her math classes, you can do it too. So what you wanna do is cut out a square of the fabric that you're looking to use. So for example, let's say the square that you cut out is a 4 by 4 inch square. From there, what you're going to want to do is stretch it out against a ruler and figure out how far can you stretch that fabric. And at that point, you measure both distances, right? So you have the measurement of the original, the 4 by 4, and then you have the measurement of the stretched out version. So let's say it's 6 inches. Now, for the formula, it's very straightforward. What you're going to want to do is divide the stretched out version, so the 6, by the unstretched version. In this example would be 4. So you got 6 divided by 4, pop out a number, and then you subtract 1. In this particular example, this particular fabric stretches out to a 50% stretch. Cool. Now you've seen your fabric can stretch as far as the pattern is calling for. Great, but you're not done. Unfortunately, especially as somebody with a large chest, this has happened to me plenty of times. Even though the fabric can stretch that much, does not mean it probably should. So, again, taking a look at how far that stretch is and observing what happens to the fabric. Does it warp? Does the elastic show? Does it not bounce back? So maybe pull it back if you're starting to see some of that happening. And you start to see, okay, cool, this fabric doesn't look good past the 20% stretch. This fabric does look fine when it goes up to 100% stretch. So use that to guide whether or not the fabric that you really want to use should be used in its full stretch capacity, especially if you have a large chest, because this will impact how much you want to do a full bust adjustment, right? And we'll be talking about that as we talk about the sizing. Picking out a pattern size for your knit tops is pretty straightforward if you have to do a full bust adjustment. It's generally the same across different garment types. So for example, you'll want to be looking at the measurements that are not likely to change and that you can adjust around. So, you know, for example, like your shoulder width, that's not likely to change. Generally, you have the same frame, even if you gain or lose weight, even if one area is bigger than the other. Like your shoulder width is usually pretty standard. Then same thing like with the high bust. Yes, there might be some minor fluctuations there, but for the most part, this distance kind of around the top of your bust is generally pretty standard. Again, the waist, I really don't pay attention to that much, and the hips either, because those can be expanded out at a later time. Now, if you're just starting out sewing, please go ahead and check out my how to read a pattern envelope video, which will kind of go into the different sections of the pattern envelope. If you're looking at it and you're like, nope, this is overwhelming, I break all that stuff down, and you can go ahead and check that out in the link. All right, we have reached the money shot. This is the crux of picking the size, and especially with stretch garments, it can be a lot, and it involves math. And it's why I'm grabbing my notes from over here, because we're talking numbers again. All right, so as I'm speaking, numbers will appear on the screen, which will kind of give more of a real life example of me, of my measurements, of the garment that I'm making for this video. So on the screen right now, you'll see my measurements. As you can see, my high bust is 41 inches, my bust is 45, and my waist is 40. So looking at the pattern itself that I'm making, I know reading the pattern envelope that it's a recommended 40% stretch, and comparing the size chart to my measurements, the closest one that I'm to is 16. Now, I want to be clear in my explanation right now that the math that we're doing for right now is just to pick the size. This is not how much to do the full bust adjustment size part of it. We'll be doing that in the next section. But for right now, this is triangulating down to what is the right size that you're going to want to pick for your knit piece. Okay, so we know what the completed measurements are of this particular piece. Again, they will flash on the screen. Now, the fabric that I picked was actually a 40% plus stretch. So I know for sure it will stretch even past that 40%, but it does start to warp. So I know that even at the 40%, it's fine, but like if it goes past that, there's a problem, right? So as I'm looking at size 16, I'm looking at what are the completed sizes on that particular garment, right? So if I do the size 16, I know that the bust is going to be 39.75, and I know the waist is going to be 33.75. Now, if you compare that against my Bianca measurements, there's a difference there, right? That's the negative ease. That's saying, cool, the garment will be smaller than your body, but with the stretch of 40%, it will stretch out to this size, right? But obviously, you want to cross-reference that, you want to check, and you want to see, cool, if I'm using a fabric of 40%, and these are the completed pieces, how much will it stretch comfortably to fit my body? Another formula will appear on the screen, because math, and because, yeah, I'm sorry. So the formula that's on the screen is to figure out, cool, if I'm using a percentage of whatever, and these are the completed garment pieces, or the sizes of the garments, how much will it actually realistically stretch at the end of the day, right? So on the screen, we see finished garment times 1 point percentage of stretch. And at that point, you can see what those sizes are. So in this instance, if I were to pick the size 16, which I did, and they fit great, but size 16, you can see that the bust will stretch out to, with 40%, 55.65 inches, and the waist will stretch out to 47.25 inches. It means that with this fabric, with my 40% fabric, the whole garment will stretch out to that size. All right, everyone, we have reached the main event of doing this full bust adjustment. I know we've gone through a journey, but you know, this is where the beauty of knit fabrics comes into play, because you know, the advice that we always get is like, oh, it's so forgiving, but this is where the magic happens, and this is where the forgiveness of the knit fabrics comes into play. Now, general recommended guidelines for most full bust adjustments is usually add an extra inch for a C cup, add 2 inches for a D/double D, and then, you know, an inch from there. Luckily, if you're using a fabric with high stretch, so hand wavy 40% stretch or more, you can actually probably follow those guidelines. I highly recommend doing that, and that's what I'll be doing here. However, if you're using something with very light stretch, where it does not stretch that much, I recommend making a half muslin, which I have done in plenty of my other videos. I'll actually put a screenshot here of the video to look for the first time that I made this that I talked about this concept, where I actually did make a half muslin first and then measured out the exact amount that I needed. But if you are working with a fabric of like 40% stretch or more, you should be good to follow the guidelines that I've outlined, and I'll make sure that those numbers show up on the screen for you. But before we start marking things up and like getting into it, please go ahead and like, share, and subscribe if you have not already. If you're liking this sort of content, it'll encourage me to do more, as well as pop this up for other people to check out and also learn from this. The first thing you want to do with any full bust adjustment is identifying where the bust point is. Now, I'm gonna hold this one up here. This, if you're looking at this pattern piece for this bodice front, does not have a bust point. Why? Because it's a t-shirt. I mean, it's not going to have that for the most part, especially since it doesn't have a dart that is going to it. You'll sometimes find, you know, patterns that will have the bust point designated, but in most cases for these sort of garments, there won't be one. All right, so if you're looking at a pattern piece without the bust point and you're going to be doing this full bust adjustment on your t-shirt or on your no dart piece, the first thing you're going to want to do is take your handy dandy tape measure, and you're going to actually be measuring down the shoulder to your bust point, and then actually the distance between your bust points, because you have to imagine that in this piece here, you can work with that. You can see that the center front of your garment, which would be the center between your two bust points, you can measure out from there. And then same thing from the top of the shoulder, measuring it down. So I've already done those measurements, so I'll go ahead and draw on my pattern what that intersection is, so you can see kind of what I'm talking about. So I know that from the top of my shoulder down to the bust point is 10 inches. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Well, helps if I put the marker on there, right? Okay, so 10 inches. Now, mind you, you do have to account for the seam allowance in the top of the shoulder. So I'm gonna go ahead and just do that quick line there. So 10 inches straight down. Cool. Now, between my bust points, it's actually, you know, they're actually pretty far apart. So it's like, I think 8 inches, something like that. Yeah. So to the center front, it's actually 4.5 inches. I actually have the number here, so I'm gonna go ahead and 4.5 that up. All right, so I was close-ish. So I'm like, let's do a little bit further up so we can see this clearly. Obviously take a little bit more care than I'm doing in this video. But we have here bust point. Bam. Okay. So in most instances of doing a full bust adjustment, you're actually gonna go do a line straight down. So, okay, I'll switch markers. So the purple was strictly to identify the bust point. The actual full bust adjustment we're gonna do in the blue. So we're gonna go one line straight down. And then we're going to do one out 90 degrees to the side seam, because this is where our like fake dart that we're gonna do to do a manipulation will be. Now from there, another line, the third line to like the arm side. Now you always usually want to do it like in the last third. You can usually eyeball it, which is great. So I'm just gonna go ahead and draw that line. So this is where, you know, we do our traditional bust adjustment first. So the first thing I'm gonna do is go up to the bust point. Then I'm gonna go out to the arm side. Now you're gonna wanna leave a little hinge at about the seam allowance. So I'm gonna go both ways here, leave a little bit of a hinge there. And then the last line that we're doing is from the side of the dart. And I'm gonna go all the way to our bust point there. Cool. So if you've done bust points and bust adjustments in the past, this is a pretty familiar sort of setup, right? We have our hinge action going on. First thing we're gonna do is tape in our 2 inches. Okay, so I'm gonna leave that aside, making sure not to cut through things yet. So we're going to go ahead and add our 2 inches because double D, so I'm gonna add 2 inches to account for that full bust adjustment. Again, because I'm using a 40% stretch, if you're using a fabric with less stretch, make sure to do that half muslin just to make sure that you don't need more. All right. I get a lot of questions about the type of paper that I use in my adjustments. I'll go ahead and link down in the description what the dot paper is that I use. It's relatively cheap and you can buy it in bulk. All right, okay. And we're going, more tape. All right, so if this was a regular bodice with a dart, we would basically be done. We would just chew our dart area that we've opened up and then redraw our dart. But because we're not going through that regular process, there are some things that we'll have to take into account. All right, so the first thing I'm gonna do, just to get it out of the way, is redraw the arm size. Now, I know that there are some people who are concerned about the adjustments in the shoulder, like if you have a sleeve. So I highly, okay, so I highly recommend truing your sleeve to the adjustments that you make. I did have a video about that where I talk about that a little bit more in depth, but it involves walking the 2 pattern pieces together. All right, so I've just drawn a new curve there to make that a little bit more gradual. Now, as we take a look at this pattern piece, we can see that we have a big adjustment here because we do need to bring down the center front. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. And we also have this opening here for the dart, and our bust point is still kind of where it originally was because we're using the front of the bodice. That's how we identified our bust point. So I'm gonna go ahead and bring down the center front. If I find my scissors, okay. Okay, so we have now completed the first part of this no dart full bust adjustment. So you might recognize this. This is just a plain old bust adjustment so far. But here's the part that starts to make it different, is that now we have to actually pivot our dart. So in most cases, we might, especially as people who have a larger chest, we might have gotten used to pivoting darts, but we have to do that like on a bigger scale with this bodice piece. So we know our bust point is here again, because we've measured out. So I'm gonna go ahead and redraw this dart to this bust point from the legs there. And so I'm gonna do that, what color have I not used? I'm gonna do that in the orange so you can see where we're at. So we got this action going on. And over here. But this is where it gets kind of crazy. So we're going to, again, now, cut at this line here. Again. All right, so if we have drawn out the dart to the bust point and again, the center front. Here we go. So I'm going to go ahead and literally just cut this out completely. All right, now from the bottom. Don't get scared. Okay, so we're gonna leave a little hinge here. And here we go. We are now going to close the dart on the side because again, we don't want a dart. Screw the dart. Okay, I know the pattern is probably looking really terrifying right now, but hang in there with me. Okay. Whew. All right, so what do we have now? We have a side dart that is completely closed. You can see that at the shoulder, things are not lining, or at the top of the, or right underneath the arm site, things are not lining up. That's fine. And then we have a huge open dart at the bottom. So this is where we have to get a little bit crafty and just accept the stretchiness of the fabric we're going to use. So before I go into it, I'm going to go ahead and kind of talk about what we're observing in the pattern. So right now, if we were to cut this out like this, we would have like a flare out at the side, right? Diagonal. All right, so essentially what would be happening is that we would have a weird curve and then the fabric would flare on the side. So obviously we don't want that. Usually t-shirts and things like this kind of fit smoothly. So what I am going to do at this point is fill in paper here in the middle, and then I'm going to redraw this edge. Now it's going to be a gradual curve, and that's okay. Why? Because essentially this extra fabric that goes down in a curve at the bottom of the pattern is going to add to the amount of fabric that goes over your bust. Also, the side, we're going to redraw that. And this dart length that we have rotated, we're actually going to cut out from the side. Now, in the video that I did previously on this, a lot of people were very confused about this. So that's why I'm kind of slowing down at this point. You know, essentially we are going to pivot the dart out from the side. So this distance here, we are going to cut out from the side of the pattern, redraw our line down, and then grade everything through. Yes, this will make the front of the pattern a little bit longer than the back. This is another question that I got a lot of. It's like, will this make the front and the back? As long as they match on the side seams, you're fine. You do want just a little bit of an addition in the front, again, to go over the bust because you don't have the dart to create that cup, right? So this will naturally pull up the front of the pattern to go over the bust. So let's go ahead and do this. We have taped the bottom. Your ruler, what is the difference in the space that you've opened? So I'm gonna go ahead and I guess we'll do the orange and just do this line here. We'll wanna use our French ruler to kind of smooth that out later, but for right now, I just wanna know what the difference is because this is what we'll be taking out of the side of the pattern. So we know that this is 7.5 inches. Where's my 7.5? All right, that's how much we want to take out from the side. So I'm going to draw my seam allowance. Hey everyone, Editing Bianca here. So don't draw in the seam allowance like I did. Just go ahead and take that measurement from the side seam and then draw in the seam allowance. If you do it the way that I did, the waist is gonna not be as wide as it needs to be. So just keep that in mind. Take the measurement out first, then add in the side seam. All right, back to the video. Just for the sake of making sure that I do this correctly, 7.5 puts me here or so. So we know that eventually we need to be able to get from here down to here while still keeping our curve. So, is this ruler long enough? No, but I'm going to guesstimate it. Hell yeah, okay. So that's that's roughly where this pattern will end up after we, after we do our soft, gentle curve. So, this is where your reference to your back pattern piece is kind of important, so I have it here on the side. You can see that eventually, there is a huge gap here, but the curve is going to have to mirror this, so always keep that in mind as you're drafting here. And I'm going to generally try and mirror what we have here on the side seam. So if we kind of look at the two, we're generally in this direction, so I'm gonna go ahead and mirror that curve here as well. I'm gonna do that in the black. Hi, hello. Guess what? You're not allowed to be here right now. Come on, dudes. Gosh. Okay. Let's see if we can try that again. So we've got this curve going on. We're gonna mirror that here. It comes out a little bit. Again, this line is, this pencil line that I drew is just a general guideline. All right, so we know that our next curve is kind of in this direction. So I'm gonna go ahead and do this. And then our last curve is kind of in this direction. So we're gonna kind of do that number as well. All right, we're getting places. All right, so what have we done? Before I cut anything out, we have pivoted our dart out. We have taken these 7.5 inches out of here. Again, before you commit to this line that you just drew, take your back pattern piece and make sure to walk it, right? Figure out what that seam allowance was. I have a video that kind of talks specifically about walking your pattern piece, and I'm not gonna fully do it to scale right now since this is just a general demo, but you're gonna wanna go ahead and do this all the way down to the bottom. Watch the video for more details. Now, this is where it gets, a little hand wavy. You have to be gentle with yourself as you do this, because essentially what we've done, and you can see here on the general estimate, there's a big difference between the back pattern piece and the front pattern piece. So this is where, you have to take your French curve and draw in new side seams from the bottom. So in this one, for example, let's say that I walk it and everything matches. I would go from here and do this number. Let me go ahead and whoop. And at this point, you can see that our front pattern piece is already longer than the back, but we've made up for it by making sure those side seams line up and are smooth. And from here again, you can go ahead and smooth this out in the front. Now, I found in the versions that I have made that the front tends to be a little bit too long to go over the full bust. So you can go ahead and bring it up depending on how much you deem that is. And you might want to go ahead and, I'll take the tape ruler for this, do from the top to the bottom. Is that way too long? Do I need to bring it up? And then adjust accordingly from the bottom. But I'm gonna go ahead and cut this out so you can see what this shape looks like at this point. Again, for the side seam, walk it against the back, make sure everything lines up. And again, the forgiveness of the knit fabric does a lot here. But at this point, you've added extra space for the bust, and you've adjusted the arm scythe a little bit. You've identified where on the pattern piece your bust point is in case you need to do any additional changes. Go ahead and cut this one here in the front. And muslin for days. Don't be like Bianca and use a different stretch fabric for your muslin than your regular fabric that you're going to use on the piece. Again, these adjustments and this adjustment as a whole is based off of the fabric that you're using. So at this point, we have now adjusted these pieces. There's a little bit more space on the bottom and on the side here. I guess I could hold it up like this. There's a little bit extra space on the bottom and the side to account for things. There's a little bit more space on the bottom of it to account for the top of the bust, or like for the going over the bust. And yeah, play around with it. Let me know what you think. Drop me down any questions down below in the comment section if you have tested it out, what worked, what didn't, if there's any additional tips that you've found in doing this as well. I'm sure everybody who's watching this video would really appreciate knowing those. As you can see from the completed piece, there is a huge improvement. There's no more dragging from the arms. The fabric is a little bit less stressed out and relaxed. It actually fits comfortably versus feeling like a little bit of a sausage in it. Obviously, there is so much more to learn about full bust adjustments, and I have a huge playlist where I have a lot of tutorials for this. So go ahead and watch those, and I'll catch you on the next one.